Dang it. The next thing that we need to address on the cylinder heads of the Texas XJS is that of the intake ports. You want to do that before you put it together because there's a pretty significant amount of aluminum filings and debris that's created during that process. So we want to do that, we want to clean these up, and then we'll reassemble the heads. Now, we don't really have to put a high-performance valve or intake port job on these cylinder heads. All we're trying to do is just make them uniform. And if you can get in a little bit closer here, you can see that these heads have been chopped away at pretty significantly, and they're not real uniform. Some of them actually show some of the original sand cast, others don't. So I think it's only going to take me a couple of hours to do, and it will make a better pair of cylinder heads. So the first thing we do is we take a Sharpie, and part of this process is matching the cylinder head port up with the gaskets, and then I'm going to be doing the same thing on the other side in the intake manifold as well. So I've blacked this in with Sharpie and taken a gasket like this, lined it up as carefully as I can with the bolt holes, and then scribed the circle that you can see in the outside. Not a lot bigger than the outside circle of the intake port, but you can see it's significantly bigger than the actual intake port that was cast at the factory. So the flow will increase. It could increase significantly, but that's going to take some modification of some other aspects of the intake system as well. So what we're going to use here is my pneumatic die grinder, and this is a very inexpensive tool, and I was going to get an electric one, but this thing really does a very, very good job. So, so that's what we're going to do here. And you can see that we've got a couple of long burrs. This one I'm going to use for roughing it out, and this one I'm going to use for a little finer radiusing. And then when it's all over, I'm going to take this tool, which is nothing more than a piece of 1/4-inch rod with a slot cut in it, and put some sandpaper in it like that. Mount that in the tool and let that flop around on the inside, and that puts a pretty good finish on it. These aren't going to be real pretty, but they'll be uniform. Now, one of the things that we need to think about is what sort of burrs are we going to use or tools in order to remove this material. Now, these are normally made for steel. They're relatively inexpensive, and they work real well on aluminum, except that if you're not careful and take precautions, these things will load up with aluminum and become pretty worthless. So what we've got here is a product called grinder's grease, which is a lubricant for this purpose. It seems like it's basically paraffin, but basically what you do is you load it up, load your tool up with it like that. Gets hot and it lubricates turns liquid and lubricates the burr, and you do this every couple 3 minutes, and it keeps your tool clean. So we got to start on this. It's going to take a couple hours, maybe 3, in order to do a decent job, and then we can start putting this stuff back together. I've got the other head done, so could be by the end of the day today we got a pair of complete cylinder heads. just to give you some idea of how the job is going so far, I've got a flashlight down underneath the cylinder head, and we can see that we've got a fairly smooth surface. It's not going to be polished by any means. It's not that kind of engine, but you can see if we sight down the edge of the port at this point right here, you can see that it goes pretty much straight from this point to the minimum or the smallest diameter of the port down here. And if we kind of rotate around, we can see that what we got is a straight funnel from the gasket down to that smallest diameter of the inlet port. And that's what I'm shooting for in all of these. To give you a little look at what the originals were like, we're a little bit choppy. In fact, real choppy. So, can't hurt, can only make it better. Plus, you know what? I kind of enjoy doing this. It's kind of a pleasant way to spend a couple hours. All right, let's go ahead and put valves back in this cylinder head. Now, I've already got one head reassembled, ready to accept the cam box. You can see that we've got the red valve train part organizer over here, and half of those parts are gone already. So let's go ahead and do this. What I've got here in terms of tools, a couple of cleaning brushes, a magnetic pickup, my makeshift valve spring compressor, small straight slot screwdriver, a plastic hammer, and a little tub full of really sticky grease. A little more insight in terms of my valve spring compressor. I'm sure there are better compressors out there, but this one actually works really, really well. And as you can tell, it's a bent up old C-clamp with a 13/16 spark plug socket on the end with a notch cut out of it. And it's got the swiveling pad cut off and this portion of it polished up here so that it doesn't damage the head of the valve when I'm using it. So, how do we do this? Well, pretty simple. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a brush through our guide. There's a little assembly lube on that brush. So we sort of pre-lubed things there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take and use a little carb cleaner to put a final clean on our valve head and stem. And we're going to shoot a little carb cleaner on our rag and clean the seat and the inlet of the intake valve to make sure that everything's as clean as we can possibly make it. Next thing we're going to do is put a little assembly lube on the valve stem. Now you got to remember there's less than 0.02 of an inch clearance between the stem and the guide, so you don't need a ton of lubricant on that stem. And go ahead and install that. And I rotate it as I go so that it sort of worms the assembly lube in with it as it goes. Going to move this down a little bit. Now, what we can do is take and put a little assembly lube, which is really sticky, on the back side of the bottom valve spring guide. Slide that in place, seat it down like that. The next thing we're going to do is install the valve seals, and you can see that a valve seal is a round neoprene thing with a small hole on one side with some ribs on the inside which holds lubricant. On this side we've got a large diameter hole which is what's going to press on over the end of the valve stem. Now the first step is to Put a little lubricant on the inside of the small diameter so it doesn't start up dry. You do not want to get lube on the inside of the big hole because you're relying on that to grab onto the end of the valve guide and not slip. What we're going to do now is we're going to take the valve seal and sort of wobble it on. You don't want to push it straight on because you could damage the seal on the inside. So there we go. And then you push it on the end of the valve guide and everything's on the way it should be. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the valve springs. So we take our springs, 2 of them, put them together, put the retainer on the outside or on one end, get our valve spring compressor adjusted properly and slide the springs on. We're then going to take the valve spring compressor, position it on the end of the valve springs, and then start turning the bolt down against the head of the valve. Make sure it's in the center so we don't pull the valve spring off center, and then just start twisting. And you don't have to go all the way down to spring bind, but that's okay. Then we take our keepers, put a little bit of grease on them. John Deere combine grease, stickiest stuff that I know of. And then stick it to a magnet. And then position it inside. And then pull the magnetic pickup free. Okay? And then we do the same thing with the other half. So there you go. The next step then is to slowly release the pressure on the springs and making sure that the retainer doesn't knock the keepers out of position. And there you've got an installed valve spring. You then take your plastic hammer, bang it a little bit to make sure that the keepers are seated firmly in the retainer, and you got yourself an installed valve. 11 to go, and then we're done.